Okay, so apologies in advance for putting a Disney earworm into your brain hole, but we need to talk about Bruno. No. He's the estranged uncle of family Madrigal, but despite his absence, Bruno is central to the conflicts explored in the film, and his influence across the family is key to saving the day. He's one of the most important foils for understanding protagonist Mirabel's own journey and evolution, as well as a vehicle for understanding big topics like familial taboos, scapegoating, and estrangement. Bruno's an unsung hero, so let's sing his song! I'm ScarletWhit, and you're watching WhitneyVision. This is your spoiler warning! If you haven't seen Encanto yet, it's available on Disney+, and it's definitely worth the watch. It's got a massive cast, but is written in a way that actually gives a surprising amount of depth to a majority of the characters. You can definitely tell that the music is written by Lin-Manuel Miranda, almost distractingly so. But if you can bat away the thought of the Hamilton cast singing every song, you'll find 2 or 3 numbers destined to be future Disney classics. Shout out to MVP Surface Pressure, but the catchiest is clearly We Don't Talk About Bruno. And that's the taboo we're breaking today. Let's get into it. So much of Encanto's conflict is rooted in generational trauma, and while Bruno isn't the first link in this chain, he is by his own misfortune the apparent source of the family's woes. But as we learn, much of the real responsibility for the Madrigal's waning magic lies on his mother's shoulders. Alma Madrigal might be the antagonist of the film, but her motivations come from a genuine place of love, even if that love did morph into toxicity over the years. She was a young woman whose perfect future was ripped away from her by war. Side note, being as this is set in Colombia, this violent interruption in Alma's life is speculated to be the Thousand Days' War, a civil war from 1899 to 1902 that is notable for being the deadliest conflict in Colombian history. Despite losing the love of her life, Alma is blessed with a miracle, and she's able to raise a prominent family within the mountains of Encanto. According to Encanto's screenwriter, Charisse Castro-Smith, these mountains close off the refugees of Encanto from the outside world, and this symbolically represents Alma walling off her painful past so that she can focus her attention on a brighter future for her family. As this burgeoning matriarch, she's similar to Luisa in that she must muster the strength to overpower the entire family's burdens. And like Isabella, she internalizes that perfection is the only path forward. While the nuances of these values of strength and perfection are criticized under the microscope in Encanto, they may also have been necessary survival mechanisms for Alma during this time. She survived a war that devoured her childhood home, likely killing countless friends and family in the process. Living through that experience would definitely instill a strength of will, as well as a strict, narrow method for navigating the world. And once given the miracle of a new home and a second chance at life, it isn't surprising that she would strive to squeeze out every last ounce of living to honor her gift, not just for herself, but also for the people she cherishes the most. This is the root of her perfectionism, and from her POV, it's noble. The problems that arise over generations, however, stem from her ideals and plans clashing with her family's own ideals and plans, and also with reality. Bruno represents the first hiccup in Alma's second shot at life. While we're only given brief clues as to his role in the family prior to Mirabel's door ceremony and his self-imposed banishment, there's a lot that can be gleaned from his history. We know that he was the youngest of the Madrigal triplets thanks to a tweet from director Jared Bush, which is honestly a little surprising to me because both he and Mirabel fall into classic middle child tropes, but more on that later. We also know from another tweet by Bush that Bruno and his siblings are 50 during the movie, meaning that he was 40 when Mirabel had her door ceremony and he had the vision that prompted his exile. I'm going to make the informed assumption that a devoted family-driven matriarch like Alma wouldn't be very pleased with a son showing no prospects of having a family of his own by age 40. It's hard to say whether or not he had romantic options at any point, with him seemingly being a pariah even within his own family, or if he even wanted children or a partner of his own at all. Regardless of it being choice or circumstance, Bruno's isolated branch on the family tree was likely a concern for Alma, a bit of a blemish on the family's picturesque outward appearance to the public. Now, based on Alma's complete arc, I generously don't think she was ashamed of having a quote-unquote weirdo son, but I do think she might have worried about the townsfolk questioning whether or not the Madrigal family could take care of the community properly, with Bruno's singlehood suggesting that things don't always go according to Alma's plans. In the metaphorical sense, he was an embarrassing crack in the House of Madrigal's aura of perfection. As we know, Alma's implied fears of being rejected by her community are ultimately found to be untrue, but we do see the pressure she puts on her family in order to maintain this unflawed image, and it's likely that Bruno faced the brunt of this tension while he was an active part of the family. In the song We Don't Talk About Bruno, we're given a glimpse of how his gift of prophecy was received. Across the board, he's seen as the source of the misfortune, even though he's only a messenger of fate and not its architect. With his gift of foresight comes the curse of being the bearer of bad news, and that's a position very few seek to fill willingly. Unfortunately for Bruno, it was thrust upon him by the magic of the casita. According to a 2019 series of psychology studies by Harvard University, bearers of bad news are judged significantly more harshly than bearers of good news, and it's common for the receivers of bad news to assume malevolent intentions from their messengers. The studies concluded that bad news has a three-pronged effect. Firstly, messengers have to struggle with the knowledge that their news will make them unlikable to their receivers. Secondly, receivers have to grapple with an undesired state of the world, and that can lead to emotional snap judgments in the moment. And thirdly, recipients are hesitant to recognize messengers as a resource for a solution to the bad news, even if the messenger can help remedy the problems. For example, think of someone ignoring a doctor's advice because they broke inconvenient and uncomfortable news to them. With this in mind, it's easy to see how Bruno's gift led him to become the most anathematized member of the family, as the public's opinion of him dropped with every unfortunate prophecy. Even his own triplet began to prescribe malice to his intentions when he mentioned rain on her wedding day. So much so that she held a grudge against him for over 20 years. Calm down, Alanis Morissette. With his own family wary of his motives and abilities, Bruno likely was always a lonely outcast, and any inconvenient truth that he brought up would spell blame not only on him, but on the Madrigal's family name. I suspect that Bruno's troubling truths and their accompanying fallouts often clashed with Alma's perfect image, and this made him into the problem child of the family. This would have made Bruno the family's scapegoat. Scapegoats are people within a group who are blamed for mistakes, misfortunes, or the faults of others. According to researcher Gary Gemmel's The Dynamics of Scapegoating in Small Groups, scapegoating is a common and sometimes abusive tool used by parents on children to minimize their own shortcomings and allow them to think that the family unit is healthier than it actually is. For example, a narcissistic parent might think that if it wasn't for their one problem child, their life would be blissful and on the right track. And this becomes a toxic tool for controlling the narrative of the family. Once a scapegoat is identified, they then become a punching bag and an outlet for negative shortcomings to be funneled through, resulting in the target becoming dehumanized, isolated, and insecure in their own abilities. We can see that even Bruno internalizes that he is bad luck because he's always knocking on wood or tossing salt over his shoulder to ward off the misfortune that he attracts. Now, it's difficult to say how abusive this scapegoating got for Bruno, as Encanto does make it clear that Alma isn't necessarily cruel or malicious, but misguided and preoccupied with values that conflict with her family's well-being. That said, clearly the family's dynamic towards Bruno, which later resurfaces as the family's dynamic towards Mirabel, was toxic enough to eventually destroy the casita's magic, symbolically breaking the family into pieces. Perhaps based on this, one might be able to theorize that off-screen tensions between Bruno and Alma were the cause of the magic waning and rejecting Mirabel on her ceremony night, although I don't personally subscribe to this theory. Alma does ask Bruno to seek an answer for Mirabel's lack of a gift, which tells me that their relationship at that point was amiable enough for Bruno to be trusted by Alma, but not good enough for Bruno to trust that Alma wouldn't lead the family in blaming him for this unexpected turn of events, and for the harrowing future he foretells. Bruno's decision to cut ties with the family he loves was informed by years of being blamed by the misfortune he was only warning others about. Not only is he breaking from the family to end the cycle of scapegoating, but he breaks the Vision's glass panel before anyone else can see it, so that Mirabel can have a chance at a childhood without her being ostracized as he was. And while he may have spared Mirabel some years of pain, her status as a powerless family member still marks her with otherness, and primes her as the family's new black sheep in his absence. Without Bruno for the family to scapegoat their troubles onto, any conflict that clashes with the Madrigal's public image or inner workings gets allocated to the family member that most closely fills Bruno's role. As I said, it's a little surprising to me that both Bruno and Mirabel are each the respective babies of their immediate families, because they easily fall into middle child narrative tropes. You know the ones.
Marcia, Marcia, Marcia!
Or in this case,
Isabella, Isabella, Isabella!
That said, if you stretch out the definition of middle child tropes to include extended family, they do both fit that bill slightly, although not perfectly. And that makes sense. The Madrigals all share a home as one singular family unit. Bruno is at the cusp of the second generation and the third generation of Madrigals, meaning he's in the shadow of his prominent sisters who are viewed as constructive members of the family, much like a middle sibling feels that they're in the shadow of their elder counterparts. He's also less of a priority than nieces and nephews for Alma's active attention, because they're the babies and they show promise as the future of the Madrigals, particularly Isabella, who's the eldest of the third generation and is the one being groomed as Alma's successor as the head of the family. Mirabel likewise is in the shadows of her powerful older cousins and siblings in Alma's eyes. She's also less of a nurturing priority, with baby Antonio shouldering the fate of the Madrigal's ability to produce more magical family members. We come into the story right about when it's proven that Antonio is worthy of a room when Mirabel is seemingly not, further alienating her as the black sheep like Bruno. And this is a tough spot to be put into. From Mirabel's point of view, there's not much she remembers of her uncle, aside from the one rule that they don't talk about Bruno. But why aren't the Madrigals allowed to talk about Bruno? Peppa and Felix clearly still want to vent about him ruining their wedding, and the fact that their whole side of the family has a song and dance about him tells me that they probably do break this rule occasionally behind closed doors. Seriously, when it comes to tea, Peppa's side of the family puts the sip in gossip. If anything, this unspoken rule about Bruno is primarily for Alma's benefit. Bringing up Bruno is bringing up Alma's greatest failure as a matriarch. Not only did her only son vanish without explanation, but he disappears when she needs his abilities the most. For the past 10 years, she's been left to wonder about what Mirabel's disastrous ceremony means for the future of the family. Bruno disappeared on her. Could the same happen to the rest of the family if she can't keep strong and maintain perfection? It's well hidden, but the anxiety she must have had waiting for Antonio's ceremony must have been a massive weight on her back. If the family was to bring up Bruno, she'd be forced to deal with this myriad of emotions: the loss of her son, the uncertainty of her family's future, her perceived failure in keeping harm from befalling her kin, and the guilt of being unable to fully honor the miracle and Pedro's sacrifice. Not talking about Bruno is how the family is able to bury their heads in the sand and avoid the reality of the situation. They make the decision to compartmentalize and wall off the baggage of Bruno in his absence, so that they can move forward. But this doesn't change that there are cracks in the family's foundation. There's another effect that happens when the rule of not talking about Bruno is raised, and it helps to restrain the family to Alma's vision of the future. Because the truth about Bruno is never spoken of, it's possible that the entire family is under the assumption that Alma banished him out of the family herself. Mirabel was surprised that Bruno left on his own volition after all, whether intentional or not. Speaking of Bruno is a taboo that all members of the family are aware of, and this makes Bruno into an example of what happens to those that go against the family's grain. Julieta warns Mirabel that she doesn't want her to lose her way in the family like Bruno did, and this paints any paths that follow a similar direction as Bruno's as dangerous. Bruno lost his family and became a boogeyman to people he loved most, a fate more painful than death to these characters that value family over everything else. Even speaking of Bruno is treated as if the same fate will befall the character that dares mention his name. This taboo is so powerful that it keeps the Madrigals on their preordained tracks and likely compounds the pressures that they feel. For example, Isabella knows that if she rejects Mariano's proposal, she might be cast out of the family like Bruno. There's also something to be said about how Camillo talks about his Tio, despite only being a few months older than Mirabel. You'd think that he also wouldn't remember or know much about Bruno either, but instead he creates the most warped and darkest image of Bruno in his musical verse. My reading is that this is influenced by what his parents have told him about Bruno in privacy. Peppa clearly believes that Bruno was out to get her on her wedding day, and this paired with stories about Bruno's visions causing uncertain doom leads to Camillo depicting him as a monstrous rat man who turns dreams into screams. I do think that Bruno's relationship with the rats is probably accurate to what Camillo remembers though. I'd imagine that Bruno's social isolation would put him in a position that would let him empathize with this group of highly intelligent creatures who are also treated with contempt by society, so he probably befriended these rats before his exile and not after he was living in the walls. Contrast Camillo's depiction of Bruno with Dolores's, who would have been 11 when Bruno disappeared. She speaks of Bruno with the most compassion out of her whole family, because she's old enough to remember him on her own. While she still says she grew up in distress of Bruno, her fears in We Don't Talk About Bruno are more geared towards his predictions and their fallout within the family than Bruno himself. As a fellow person with a humbling gift, Dolores likely learned from Bruno's treatment that keeping inconvenient truths a secret would be the best for her own well-being. This to me is the most plausible reason as to why she doesn't out Bruno's hiding place to her entire family. It would not only cause drama after 10 years of not saying anything, she might be viewed as an accomplice to Bruno's squatting. That said, she might be messier than we're giving her credit for. This gal is the reason Mirabel's quest to solve Bruno's vision is outed after all. Dolores mentioning that she knew Bruno was in the walls the whole time did feel very tacked on, almost as if it was a lampshade to hang on a plot hole. I honestly think that there's a potential reading of this movie that has Dolores believing that the rats in the walls were truly the ones worrying about Bruno's vision, and she only pieced together that he was hiding behind the walls at the very end. I'm gonna give her the benefit of the doubt and say she was just fearful of the magic disappearing during this dinner scene, but I do feel that there was some inconsistency in her character here. Side quest, can we talk about Bruno lurking in the background of her verse of We Don't Talk About Bruno? Dude is totally rocking out, it's a cool detail. Even cooler is that Dolores mentions that she associates him with the sound of falling sand, and while yes, this is likely because his tower is blocked off by a cascade of hourglass sand, it also might be that she hears him throwing salt and sugar over his shoulder in his superstitious attempts to ward off bad luck. Double side quest, does anyone else think that it's BS that the casita gave Bruno such a bad room? Like, yeah, it's a metaphor for Bruno's abilities being coarse and rough and getting everywhere, but seriously, what a jerk move, casita. Dude has an ability so ostracizing that his only friends are rats, and you go and give him a death trap to isolate him further? I'm gonna give you the benefit of the doubt and say that this creative decision was likely a holdover from the earlier versions of the script. From alleged drafts where the casita was working against Mirabel instead of with her. Drafts where the house was more of an antagonistic extension of Abuela Alma's control over the family, because then the disrespect makes some sense. Maybe Mirabel scaling a mountain temple was too cool of a scene to cut. Still, way to set the dude up for failure, you dumb miracle. Personal peccadillos and speculation about the creative direction of Encanto aside, when Mirabel discovers Bruno, he's nothing like she was told he would be. Instead of preying on her like the twisted monster he was painted as, he chooses to out himself in order to save Mirabel from a fall. Even though it might lead to him being caught and possibly banished from the casita for real, Bruno chooses to protect his family. In the aftermath, Mirabel learns that Bruno has been working to keep the casita safe from behind the scenes. Hernando and Jorge. Even without being an active member of the family, Bruno does all that he can to keep the family together by spackling the cracks of the casita, proving to viewers that he cares for his family even though he hasn't had contact with them in over a decade. I also find it interesting that Bruno entertains himself with acting. There's plenty of reasons why people are drawn to acting, but for Bruno, it appears to be a way that he can roleplay a better life than his own. Hernando is the fearless mask that Bruno puts on so that he can do that which usually spooks him. Jorge is helpful, another side of Bruno that he wishes was a bigger part of his actual self, because so much of a Madrigal's personal value comes from how helpful they can be. Another detail that I found super interesting in this section of the movie is the location of his peephole. If you notice, he views the dining table through a crack that splits through the base of the diagram of the family tree, right below his own photo. Not only do we have the symbolism that the treatment of Bruno is what threatens to timber the entire family, but we have an open wound that the magic of the casita hasn't healed from. Bruno has spent years looking out this crack, presumably years where the casita's magic was strong enough to regenerate freely. The casita even added Antonio and updated the ages of the children, but it never closed this wound. Part of me wonders if this was intentional on the casita's part, and it was giving Bruno the small consolation of being able to watch his family grow. In his hidden room, Bruno and Mirabel have a heart-to-heart, and she verbalizes something he seemingly felt his whole life.
I just wanted to make the family proud of me. Just once. But if I should stop, if I'm hurting my family, just tell me.
Bruno can't tell her because he simply doesn't know. But Bruno has experienced living through the path of stopping his own attempts of making the family proud, because his abilities and actions were ostensibly hurting the family. Perhaps if Mirabel wasn't so courageous or hopeful, she'd end up more like Bruno, but instead she pulls him with her to save the miracle. In order to do so, Mirabel puts faith in Bruno's abilities, and even though she is unhappy with what he eventually foretells, she values his contribution to the family. Bruno is the most apparent signal to Mirabel that Alma's pressures can weigh too heavily on family members other than her. And through his guidance, she speaks with Isabella and learns that this pressure to be perfect is felt across the family, even by the golden child. Through the power of the musical number What Else Can I Do?, the sisters discover that the inconvenient truths that are swept under the rug in order to preserve a sense of perfection can be beautiful in their own right, albeit a little prickly. It's a classic truth will set you free moral. So when Alma confronts Mirabel, she unveils the harsh truths that her abuela has been ignoring. The truth that no one in the family could possibly live up to her fantasy of perfection. The truth that all the cracks in the foundation of their familial love start with her. And the unspoken truth. The truth locked behind the cardinal rule of the family. That she failed Bruno and caused him to leave because she only saw him for his inadequacies. Ultimately, it's Mirabel's courage to break the taboo and speak up about Bruno and what Bruno's exile represents that causes Alma to realize that she's wrong and that her vision of the future needs to evolve to be flexible to the bend of complicated realities and desires other than her own. The Disney magic of all this is that Alma actually has the strength of character to apologize to Mirabel, Bruno, and the rest of the Madrigals. In reality, family estrangement and scapegoating aren't easily solved by simply speaking about the elephants in the room. It's a process. But what Encanto does in its final act, which I find admirable, is that it lays out an optimistic roadmap to reaching mutual acceptance. It doesn't end on a cynical rift between the whole family and Alma. Instead, Mirabel reapproaches her with respect. The path forward is together as a family, working in tandem to deal with all the imperfections of life. And sure, some real-life Almas might never accept their part in painful family breaks, but Mirabel shows that communicating through uncomfortable feelings is the first step. As Bruno said, fixing the family wasn't up to another member of the family, it was up to Mirabel. If Mirabel was the member of the family looking to mend the wounds, she would have to start that journey herself and not wait for someone else to find their own agency to do so. To begin, Mirabel had to accept herself and then accept her family for who they were if there was even a chance at healing them. Encanto gives us a best-case scenario where everyone returns in kind. And this is true to the path that many experts in family estrangement lay out for mending fractured relationships. The person who wishes to heal the home must make the effort to understand and accept the other side, because it opens the door to have the acceptance returned in kind. That is not to say that one should excuse the horrible behaviors of the past or to tolerate the same behavior moving forward, but rather to accept that the past is what it was and to give the other party the benefit of the doubt in moving forward. Reconciliation is about keeping a door open with the understanding that if both parties choose to step through it, then there are boundaries and mutual respect that must be upheld moving forward. And on the chance that both members do honor these rules and are able to hash out and accept their own feelings as well as the feelings of the other half, then the focus afterwards should be on rebuilding a future and not dwelling in the past. It's estimated that 20 to 27% of adults are estranged from another family member or members, and like we see in Bruno, that can be a difficult and isolating existence. Estrangement is due to a number of serious reasons, such as a conflict over a member's gender identity, religion, substance dependency, and a whole list of other keywords YouTube won't enjoy me putting into a Disney analysis. Bruno himself might represent behavioral disorders, as the Encanto script offhandedly labels his constant knocking as OCD. This is backed not only by these compulsions, but by the ritualistic manner of how his powers manifest. So with that in mind, I do acknowledge that mending real shattered relationships isn't an easy or necessary feat. It doesn't always end up like this fairy tale. I myself chose to continue to cut my biological father out of my life after an attempt at mending a decade-long estrangement. But even that attempt provided me with a new sense of closure. It was a difficult emotional roller coaster at the time, so if you're looking to seriously mend a family fracture, I recommend speaking with a family counselor and doing your own research before walking that path. Not all advice is universal, so learn what's best for your situation. Once more though, I think it's important to look at the hope for a better tomorrow, together as a family unit that Encanto outlines, if that's a path that one wishes to follow. So often, people can end up hurt and drifting apart when really all a relationship needs is being uncomfortable in a moment and talking about the Bruno in the room. Compromise and acceptance are things that seem often lost in modern society, and I'm glad that Encanto highlights mending rifts. If you couldn't tell, I really enjoyed Encanto, particularly Bruno's role. And after rewatching it a million times for this essay, it only gets better on rewatch. That being said, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the movie in the comments. Also, I want to thank my subscribers for waiting a few months while I adjust to my new job. Things are starting to settle in more, so more WhitneyVision will be coming to a YouTube near you very soon. 2022 has some exciting projects that I can't spoil just yet, but be sure to like, subscribe, and share this video with the Encanto lover in your life if you want to help this channel regain a foothold in the YouTube algorithm. Once more, I'm ScarletWhit, and remember, the miracle is you.